Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere scorching hot, bone-dry desert heat, where your shoes feel like bread ovens and your eyebrows sweat. Picture yourself in ancient Persia, trudging across windswept sand, the sun smirking down like it owns the place. Your robes cling to your skin. Water? You finished your last gulp a few dunes ago. And then, just as your brain starts listing favorite ice cream flavors in reverse alphabetical order, you remember these ancient Persians had a way to eat frozen desserts. Out here, in this heat. You probably wouldn't survive this journey without help, and that's where the story begins. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where and when folks are tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've started your trek from Persepolis. Yes, the ceremonial capital of the Achaemenid Empire. You're not here for politics, though. You're chasing something colder than politics. Ice. Real, touch it with your fingers, ice. The kind that crunches between your teeth and makes you forget you're in the middle of an oven. As your sandals press into the sand, your guide, a guy named Ardashir, with an enviably sweat-free brow, tells you that a day's walk ahead, nestled at the foot of the mountains, lies a structure built for one thing only: preserving winter in the middle of summer. The air smells of dry stone and baking salt. There's little shade. But at night, oh, it flips. Cold breezes slink down from the mountains like they have unfinished business. That's how these Persians pulled off their first trick. See, historians agree that the Persians built entire cities and road networks in blistering landscapes. But what many people don't realize is just how much they engineered their environment. They didn't wait for mercy from the sun. They outsmarted it. They picked city sites where geography worked in their favor. Elevated plains near snow-fed mountain ranges meant even desert dwellers could tap into the chill. Water channels, or qanats, brought melted snow underground for miles. And when it got really hot, they didn't complain. They just built smarter. Imagine walking beside a canal shaded by mud brick walls, the air dropping by several degrees as you step close. That's not magic. That's thermodynamics. And maybe a pinch of architectural genius. They used pale-colored materials to reflect sunlight. They aligned buildings to catch or block wind, depending on the season. And in the case of ice, well, that's a whole story in itself. It might sound simple to say they had ice, but consider this. In 500 BCE, there was no electricity, no refrigeration, and yet these people figured out how to make and store ice in the desert. Historians still argue whether they discovered this by accident or through observation and experimentation over generations. One fringe theory suggests they noticed how certain desert valleys naturally chilled more at night, enough for water to freeze in clay bowls. Another posits that watching how some animal burrows stayed cool led to architectural mimicry. Whatever the spark, the result was real. They built domed structures from a mix of mud, ash, egg whites, yes, really, and goat hair. These thick walls insulated like nothing else. The foundations were dug deep. And the ventilation? Oh, we'll get to that. But right now you're still walking. Sand crunching, sun dipping. And in the distance, a strange mound, dome-shaped, with an opening like a yawning cave. You don't know it yet, but you're looking at a yakchal, a Persian ice house. You squint. It looks like a beehive, but cooler, literally. You step closer to the yakchal, and it rises before you like some kind of ancient spaceship, completely out of place among the beige flatness of the surrounding desert. Its smooth, conical walls shimmer faintly in the dying sunlight, made from a mud-straw-clay mixture known as sarouj, which is waterproof, heat-resistant, and somehow still standing centuries later. Touch it, and it feels like sun-baked stone, warm to the hand but hiding secrets inside. Your guide, Ardashir, doesn't say much. He simply places a hand on the outer wall with the kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred sites. You do the same, and feel a faint draft. Air. Cool air. See, this thing isn't just a building. It's a temperature trap. And it starts with where it's built. Most yakchals were placed carefully near mountains, allowing easy access to ice that had been collected from higher altitudes. But the genius wasn't just in storage, it was in preservation. Inside that conical vault is a deep subterranean pit, sometimes descending over 20 feet below the desert surface, where summer heat couldn't easily reach. And above? The cone's shape wasn't for show. Heat rises, and this shape channeled it away from the stored ice. At night, cooler air flowed downward. During the day, thick sarouj walls and clever ventilation kept the internal climate steady. Honestly, if you're picturing a giant ancient thermos, you're not far off. Now step inside. You duck beneath a low arched entrance and immediately feel it. A rush of cool, earthy air. It's almost like walking into a wine cellar or the world's most overbuilt clay igloo. Inside, it's quiet. The thick walls mute the wind. The air smells faintly of dust, stone, and something else. An icy tang, like old snow clinging to memory. You can almost hear the drip of condensation. Back in its heyday, this pit would have been stacked with great blocks of winter ice, packed in straw or sawdust for insulation. Some ice was natural, hauled down from mountain glaciers by ox-drawn sleds in the dead of night. But here's the kicker. The Persians didn't just store ice, they made it. Historians still argue whether this process started as early as 400 BCE or came later during the Sassanid era. Either way, it's bizarrely brilliant. Picture a shallow pool beside the yakchal, just a few inches deep, wide and open to the night sky. On a particularly cold night, even in the desert, water would freeze. By dawn, workers would collect the thin ice and move it inside the structure. Night after night, they'd layer it like pastry sheets, creating a giant seasonal popsicle in reverse. And guess what? This worked best in arid climates. With no clouds to trap heat, desert nights often dip drastically, especially in winter. Combine that with still air and high-altitude breezes from nearby mountains, and you've got yourself a natural freezer. The process wasn't fast. It required patience, rhythm, and teamwork. But the result? Usable ice stored well into the summer months. Fringe tidbit? Some believe these frozen reserves weren't just practical, they were prestige. In royal courts, servants served snow-chilled drinks in copper goblets, or crushed ice flavored with rosewater and honey. Persian poets even wrote odes to cold sweets, praising their cooling powers during fiery midsummer days. And the elite weren't above showing off with it either. Offering guests an iced dessert in July was the ancient version of, say, owning a Tesla and never mentioning it. Except way colder. Back inside the yakchal, you imagine the echo of footsteps, bare feet padding softly as a man hauls a wrapped block into the shadows. It's quiet, sacred work. They didn't have the word refrigeration, but they understood preservation like artists. And here's something else. These buildings were almost always community projects. Villages worked together to build and maintain them. Ice wasn't just for nobles. It was stored for food, medicine, and rituals. Some scholars even suggest that babies and the elderly were cooled here during heat waves, a primitive air-conditioned ward, minus the beeping machines. And yet, despite all the engineering, there's still debate. Some believe the structures were used mainly for storage. Others argue they had ritual significance, especially when placed near temples. One academic even claimed they were just oversized grain bins misidentified by modern romantics. But then again, that guy also thought Cleopatra was Greek and blonde, so we'll let you be the judge. Back outside, the sun has fully set. Stars are winking into view, sharp and silver against the ink-black sky. The desert feels less hostile now, more like an oven finally cooling down. And the yakchal? It just sits there, doing what it's always done, keeping things cold, quietly, faithfully. Long after the empire that built it turned to dust, you spend the night near the yakchal, tucked under a wool blanket, listening to the breeze sigh through the windcatchers. It's surprisingly chilly, almost enough to make you forget you're in a desert. Ardashir wakes you early, nudging you with a flatbread stuffed with dates and pistachios. "You'll want energy," he says, nodding toward the horizon where thin frost glitters like spilled sugar across the earth. "Today, you're heading to the ice fields." Yes, ice fields in the desert. Welcome to the miracle of harvesting winter. You walk until the dome of the yakchal shrinks behind you, and eventually come to a large rectangular basin carved into the ground, its surface shallow and still. This is no ordinary puddle. It's a man-made freezing pond, carefully constructed with low walls to capture and hold overnight frost. The trick, your guide explains, is not how much water you use, but how little. Each basin is just a few centimeters deep, so thin it can freeze completely in a single night if the conditions are right. And those conditions? Oh, they had them mastered. The ancient Persians timed their freezing efforts with surgical precision. Flat terrain ensured even ice sheets. Orientation to prevailing winds maximized cooling. Workers smoothed the ground to prevent hot spots. And they built wind-blocking walls around the basin to protect the thin layer from disturbance. Everything was tuned to one purpose: help winter linger. When dawn broke and the first rays of sun licked the edges of the ice, villagers moved fast. Too slow, and it would melt. The frozen sheets were gathered like fragile pastry, stacked onto padded sleds, and pulled back to the yakchal before breakfast. One particularly poetic tablet mentions workers humming prayers to Mithra as they moved the ice, hoping the sun god would look away just a little longer. Mainstream scholars agree these seasonal ice harvests were real and widespread, particularly in central and northern Persia. where winter temperatures dipped just enough. But here's the kicker. This wasn't an imperial luxury. Ordinary people, farmers, bakers, and brickmakers, joined in the ice rush like it was a harvest of wheat. They froze their fingers, ruined their shoes, and all for a few days' worth of glittering frost. It's easy to romanticize now, but let's be honest. You'd probably have fallen flat on your face in those icy basins. No non-slip boots, no Gore-Tex gloves. Gore-Tex. Just leather sandals and determination. A modern survivalist might roll their eyes, but these people had no choice. They needed cold. For food storage. For fever treatment. And yes, for indulgence. Here's a fringe tidbit. Some villages used animal skins as portable ice buckets. Think of it. A goat bladder filled with snow, tied shut, and buried beneath layers of sand and stone. It kept its contents cold for days. We don't recommend trying this at your next picnic, but points for creativity. And still, the question lingers. Why go to all this trouble? Why not just live near rivers or highlands where snow is common? Well, remember, this was Persia, the heart of a sprawling empire. Trade routes crisscrossed it. Cities flourished in places nature didn't particularly like. You didn't get to move uphill just because you wanted to keep your sherbet cold. So instead, they brought the cold to them. Historians still argue whether these ice harvests were developed independently or borrowed from earlier Mesopotamian experiments. Babylonian tablets mention chilling clay jars in winter winds, but no full-scale frozen pond operations. Most scholars agree Persia turned casual cooling into a precise science, adapting it to harsh terrain that most civilizations simply avoided. The sun's rising higher now. You crouch beside one of the shallow basins, its water already beginning to melt at the edges. But for a moment, it glows. A delicate sheet of perfect, glinting ice, born of desert air and patience. It's quiet here. No machines. No buzz. Just the soft drip of frost returning to water. Ardashir points to the basin and grins. "We call this place Yakzan," he says. "The cold-born field." You smile, and suddenly the idea of ancient Persian ice cream doesn't sound so impossible. Not anymore. You stretch your legs and follow Ardashir down a dusty trail, leaving the glittering ice field behind as the desert warms around you. The air is starting to shift, dry, rising, buzzing softly with distant wind. But before it gets too hot, he wants to show you something even more peculiar. How the Persians didn't just store cold, but controlled it with architecture. No magic, no motors, just mud, wind, and wild ingenuity. Soon you see it. What looks like a tall, hollow tower, sprouting up like a minaret with open slats near the top. It's a badjir, or windcatcher, and once you understand what it does, you'll never look at chimneys the same way again. Windcatchers are ancient Persian air conditioners. Imagine a chimney flipped in reverse, its sole purpose to pull wind into a building, not send smoke out. Depending on the season, it either drew in cool air or vented hot air upward, and they worked shockingly well. Even on days when the sun felt like a particularly mean overlord, you duck inside the connected building, which is attached to another subterranean vault. This one is shallower than the yakchal, but longer and lined with clay bricks. Above, the windcatcher breathes, a subtle hum, as if the desert itself is exhaling into this clay throat. Here's how it works. Hot air rises. Cool air sinks. The bajir, oriented toward prevailing winds, captures cool air and funnels it downward through narrow shafts. As the breeze travels, it loses speed but gains chill, finally spilling into rooms or storage chambers below. The thick walls, often over a meter wide, retain this coolness. Combined with moisture from buried Qanat water channels, it creates a kind of swamp cooler effect, centuries before anyone coined that phrase. You run your hand along the inner wall. It's dry, but not warm. It feels maybe 20 degrees cooler than outside. Your breath fogs slightly as you move deeper in. And all of this is happening without a single moving part. Mainstream historians agree. Persian windcatchers were a cornerstone of desert architecture, used from humble homes to sprawling palaces. Some cities like Yazd were famous for their skyline of tall, silent towers, each a passive air system quietly hissing against the sun. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some windcatchers were designed with adjustable vents. People could manually block or open specific slats to direct airflow depending on the wind's direction, like tuning an ancient HVAC system. Want a breeze at dinner but not during your nap? Just shift a clay shutter and voila. Persian ergonomics. There's still scholarly debate over who invented the bajir first. Some trace its origins to ancient Egypt. Others insist it was Mesopotamia. But the consensus is that Persians refined the technology and applied it with unmatched consistency across an empire. Even their ice storage vaults, like the yakchal you visited, often had miniature wind catchers integrated into the design. What's even more fascinating? These weren't standalone solutions. They worked with other systems, like water channels running beneath the floors. Known as qanats, these underground aqueducts pulled snowmelt from distant mountains across miles of sand. When wind from the bajir passed over qanat-cooled floors, it chilled even more. You might be thinking, that sounds complicated. And you're not wrong. But to the ancient Persians, this was just what you did when your empire stretched across unforgiving landscapes. You didn't curse the climate. You designed around it. In a world where modern air conditioners hum all night, it's easy to forget the kind of thought that went into passive cooling. These were buildings that breathed, structures in dialogue with their surroundings. No remote controls, no carbon footprints, just airflow, shadows, and a deep understanding of how the desert moved. Outside again, the windcatcher towers behind you like a sentinel. You look up. There's no motor inside, no wires. But still, it's cooler here than it has any right to be. And somewhere in the distance, someone is already preparing the evening's batch of snow and saffron. By the time the sun hits its midday stride, you're back beneath the cool shade of an awning made of woven reeds. Ardashir pours you a cup of something strange, golden, floral, cold enough to mist the copper rim. You take a sip. It's unlike anything you've tasted. Sweet, yes, but not sugary. The flavor dances with saffron, rosewater, and something almost citrusy. Falude, he says, watching your eyebrows lift. The ancient version. You've just had your first taste of what many believe to be the ancestor of ice cream. Forget the churned, cream-heavy scoops you're used to. This was different, delicate, semi-frozen, and made from ingredients that could survive the Silk Road. Rice noodles, pressed and chilled in syrup. Shards of flavored ice scraped into bowls and topped with sour cherry or lime. The Persians may not have had waffle cones, but they absolutely knew how to make a summer afternoon feel like magic. Mainstream historians credit Persia, specifically around 500 BCE, as one of the first places where sweet frozen desserts were documented. The royal kitchens of Achaemenid kings served up chilled concoctions during banquets, using harvested snow from mountains or artificially frozen water from ice pits. They mixed fruit pulp, honey, and herbs with snow, creating rudimentary sorbets before Italy ever got around to coining the word. It wasn't just for nobles, though. In bazaars, vendors would crush ice and drizzle it with concentrated syrups. Workers would buy tiny cups on their midday breaks, moments of relief from the glare and grind of desert life. Over time, these icy treats evolved. In some regions, milk and cream were introduced. In others, fermented rice was used for tang. Fringe theory time? Some scholars argue that the Mongols helped spread ice cream-like ideas across Asia and into Europe after their conquests. It's entirely possible that Persian falude found distant cousins in Indian kulfi, Chinese milk ice desserts, and eventually Italian gelato. If you're enjoying a scoop of pistachio on a humid day, there's a decent chance you're tasting a legacy older than most cities. You watch as a local merchant arrives with a cart loaded with shaved ice, stored in cloth-wrapped bundles inside clay jars. He unwraps one, chips off a piece, and serves it in a brass bowl. Then he spoons over a thick golden syrup scented with orange blossom. A handful of basil seeds go in for good measure. Yes, they float like jelly. The entire dish glistens like morning frost. This is food as refreshment, yes, but also status, comfort, medicine. Ancient Persians believed chilled sweets could help balance bodily humors. Too hot? Eat something cold. Too phlegmatic? Add spice. A sophisticated system of logic met a blistering sun and decided, you need dessert. Some evenings, according to old records, nobles would host banquets where the final course was snow to make the mouth dance. Served in silver bowls lined with fig leaves, these desserts were often dyed with beetroot or saffron for color. Guests were expected to recite a line of poetry before taking their first spoonful. One surviving verse reads, "Let fire and sun conspire to burn the day. I'll cool my lips with rose and frost this way." And yes, if you're wondering, there were ice cream scandals. A few overly ambitious governors reportedly used entire seasonal ice stores to impress foreign diplomats, leaving locals to swelter. Think of it as blowing your entire AC budget for a dinner party. Of course, not everyone was convinced it was a good idea to eat frozen things. Some physicians warned that too much cold in summer could cause melancholy. Others insisted it was fine, as long as you followed it with hot tea or a nap in the sun. Historians still argue whether these frozen desserts were considered indulgence or necessity, but the evidence of joy is hard to ignore. Back under the awning, you finish your falude. It melts fast, trailing syrup across your fingers. Ardashir offers a cloth. Next, we see how the kings threw summer parties, he says, rising with a grin. They had bigger yakchals than anyone. You lick your fingertips. Sweet, cold, and just a little ridiculous. Like the best parts of history always are. You follow Ardashir through the winding alleys of a city once filled with the hum of poets, merchants, and heat-baked philosophers. The scent of cardamom and roasted wheat clings to the breeze, but even in the middle of this bustling urban memory, you can feel something different in the air. Cooler pockets, like shadows that forgot to leave. He leads you to a sprawling complex, its tall arches casting generous shade. Royal quarters, he says with a touch of pride, though his tone is more tour guide than time traveler. This is where summer became negotiable. You enter the palace courtyard, flanked by marble fountains. And while those fountains look decorative, you're already onto their trick. Persian royals didn't waste water for aesthetics alone. These pools weren't just pretty, they were thermal regulators. Shallow water reflected sunlight, cooling the courtyards through evaporative magic. The stones stayed cool longer. The air moved slower. You might say these palaces sweated for their residents. In the royal kitchens, it was a different game entirely. Large yakchals served as food vaults. One chamber stored nothing but ice, snow, and syrups. Another was reserved for fruit preserves. Pomegranates, plums, and sour cherries simmered down with honey, waiting for the right mix. And then there was a dedicated space for what today we might call ice cream staging. Imagine this. It's the middle of July. You're wearing heavy silk. A servant hands you a shallow bowl, perhaps beaten copper, cool to the touch. Inside, crushed ice laced with saffron, lemon peel, and wildflower nectar. You sit beneath a windcatcher, sunlight muted by layers of colored silk stretched across the ceiling. Musicians play in the distance, but the true performance? That's the spoon rising to your lips. Mainstream historians describe these summer banquets in remarkable detail. Cyrus the Great reportedly hosted outdoor feasts under woven canopies misted by nearby fountains. Darius I, ever the showman, was said to reward his generals with flavored snow brought down from the Zagros Mountains. One clay tablet even records an argument between two kitchen officials over who used too much cardamom in the ice rice. A cold, milky dessert, thickened with starch and chilled in ceramic bowls. Quirky detail? The royal staff had seasonal titles: ice stewards, snow bearers, even syrup scribes whose job was to inventory and label jars of infused molasses, flower waters, and fruit pastes. There was a whole sub-hierarchy of people whose careers revolved around keeping things deliciously frosty. But of course, this wasn't just about flavor. Royal summer events were political theater. Offering a guest chilled wine or a frozen rosewater treat wasn't just hospitality, it was a flex. "Look how powerful we are," it said. "Even the sun bends to our will." Still, not everyone enjoyed it equally. Kitchen apprentices often slept beside the yakchals to monitor melting rates. There's one amusing, and possibly exaggerated story of a young steward who accidentally fell asleep inside a storage chamber and emerged several hours later frozen but unharmed, blinking into the daylight like a confused time traveler. Historians still debate how widespread these luxuries were. Were they confined to the royal courts? Did lesser nobles in the provinces replicate the same? Some argue that Persian culinary knowledge was more centralized than we assume. Others suggest that icy desserts traveled outward via marriage alliances, diplomatic gifts, and even the occasional chatty servant switching employers. Either way, what's clear is this. Long before Paris had patisseries, Persia had palaces with purpose-built dessert rooms. You walk slowly through the palace's faded splendor, imagining silver trays stacked with melon-stuffed ice, musicians half dozing in the heat, and guests exhaling visible breath into the dry summer air. It's a contradiction you can't help but love. Cold, carefully crafted, and utterly human. Ardashir lingers at a doorway before turning back. Next, he says, we visit the market, where cold was sold by the spoonful. And suddenly, royalty doesn't seem quite so distant, just better funded. You leave the palace behind, its cool corridors, polished floors, and absurdly well-chilled snacks, and re-enter the pulse of the city. It's mid-afternoon now, and the bazaar is alive. Not loud exactly, but full of motion. The gentle thud of sandals, the rhythmic chant of sellers, the rustle of linen canopies overhead, trying their best to pretend the sun doesn't exist. Ardashir guides you down a narrower path lined with spice shops and glassware, then pauses in front of a stall that looks unremarkable at first glance. A worn wooden sign above reads something like, "Sweet waters and cooling syrups," though the paint has mostly flaked off. What catches your eye is the enormous clay pot at the center, its mouth sealed with cloth, its surface beaded with condensation. The seller grins, revealing molasses-colored teeth and a twinkle that says he's been cooling things longer than most people have been breathing. "Sharbat e yakdar," he declares, ladling out a portion. It translates loosely as iced syrup, but in reality, it's one of Persia's most enduring culinary inventions. You sip. It's tart and floral, thick with crushed ice and perfumed with rose. A few slivers of cucumber float lazily in the cup. Your tongue tingles. Your forehead stops sweating. Your brain, quite frankly, wants to hug someone. Street vendors like this were the original masters of refreshment. Long before refrigeration, they figured out how to store ice under canvas tents, buried in pits lined with straw or ash. They'd shave it down using curved blades, then mix it with syrup steeped in everything from hibiscus to sour tamarind. For a few copper coins, you could turn a miserable day into something bearable, even beautiful. Mainstream accounts from medieval travelers, like Ibn Battuta and even early Venetian traders, mention Persian markets offering cold drinks even in summer. They marveled at the efficiency, the selection, and the strange comfort of sipping chilled nectar in a place where sandals melted if you stood still too long. Fringe tidbit? Some vendors carried their ice in hollowed-out gourds, slung over their shoulders like water skins. A layered system of linen, wool, and clay kept the gourd insulated. They'd slice into it like a magician revealing a rabbit. Voila! Snow in July. But there was more than just refreshment for sale. In between mouthfuls, Ardashir points out the ice perfume stall, where sellers keep tiny clay pots filled with flour-infused snow. Customers dab it onto their necks or wrists, or wave it beneath their veils like natural air freshener. The scent, amplified by the chill, was considered both luxurious and mildly flirtatious. And not far off, a cart selling iced pickles. Yes, pickles. Vinegar-brined vegetables, briefly buried in snow, then served with a drizzle of mint oil. Not exactly Baskin-Robbins, but in 11th century Persia it was wildly popular. This was more than dessert. It was public infrastructure. Cold things weren't confined to palaces. They reached the streets, made possible by shared ice houses, local harvests, and an understanding that some luxuries are best enjoyed communally. That said, there were rivalries. Historians still argue over whether Shiraz or Isfahan had the best street syrups. Regional disputes over sugar content, flour selection, and serving temperature occasionally made it into local poetry. One surviving verse accuses a Shirazi vendor of watering his roses with tears, not dew, implying that his rosewater syrup was heartbreakingly bland. Another scholar claims that cooling rites, the ability to draw ice from a town's yakchal, were sometimes auctioned off, giving rise to seasonal monopolies. If true, that means entire neighborhoods may have had to negotiate for the right to make snow sherbet. As you finish your drink, the vendor offers you a second one, this time flavored with mulberry and basil seed. He doesn't charge you. Ardashir says it's because he likes your face. You suspect it's because you actually finish the whole cup. Not everyone does. The flavors are bold, layered, and unapologetically fragrant. You step away from the stall and into a pocket of cooler air where another windcatcher sighs overhead. In your hands, the cup still sweats. And just like that, you realize that even in ancient times, the marketplace wasn't just about goods. It was about relief, about small pleasures, and about communities who figured out how to turn blistering sunlight into an excuse for something sweet. Evening is sliding in now, softening the sun's edge like a hot coin cooling in your palm. The bazaar begins to quiet. Vendors roll up their canvas awnings. Children splash their feet in tiled fountains. Somewhere, a flute pipes out a melody that drifts over rooftops like perfume. Ardashir leads you away from the city center, past humble brick homes with blue-painted doors, to a quieter district where private courtyards hide behind high clay walls. You've seen the palaces, he says, but this is where ice met family. You enter through a low archway into a courtyard garden, not grand, but perfectly serene. There's a shallow pool in the center, reflecting stars now peeking through the twilight. Around it, grapevines climb trellises, and the air smells of jasmine and sun-warmed stone. A woman brings out a tray of small dishes. On one, frozen grape must, spooned into little bowls and topped with mint. On another, chilled almond paste wrapped in fig leaves. This, Ardashir explains, was the domestic side of Persian cool. Families didn't just rely on yakchals for storage. They integrated cold into their daily rhythm. Afternoon naps in the cellar, morning tea steeped in snowmelt, cold towels hung in breezeways. There was a seasonal choreography to keeping cool, and it began, always, at home. The center of the home was often a hauzkhana, a cool room built partially underground, with a small water basin and access to the qanat system. If you've ever dreamed of a reading nook that doubles as an ancient air-conditioned cave, this was it. Mainstream historians agree these rooms were architectural masterpieces. With water flowing beneath and thick earthen walls, temperatures could remain 10 to 15 degrees lower than outside, perfect for midday retreat, food storage, or even sleeping during the hottest weeks of the year. Many were positioned so that breeze from a nearby badjir could pass through a wet cloth over a window, creating a rudimentary evaporative cooler. Fringe detail? Some families froze rose water in thin clay dishes and used the resulting discs like aromatic coasters. You'd rest your wrists or neck on one between household chores. Others froze petals into the ice, more for beauty than function. Picture it. A chilled disk of translucent snow, glinting with tiny crimson blooms, melting slowly under your fingertips. But cooling wasn't all utility. It became tradition, even celebration. In midsummer, families held small ice-sharing feasts, sometimes called yak, night of ice. Cousins gathered in courtyards, elders told stories, and someone, usually the youngest, was tasked with fetching the night's treat from the ice store. It wasn't just a ritual, it was a rite of passage. You remember Ardashir grinning as he recounts how his own grandmother let him retrieve the ice for the first time when he turned 7. "She told me not to trip," he laughs, "but I dropped it anyway. We ate rose syrup over cold gravel that year." Historians still debate how much ice the average family actually had access to. Some argue it was rationed, others that local yakchals ensured modest but consistent availability. What's clear is that ice, even when precious, was shared among neighbors, between generations. No one hoarded snow in a desert village. You lean back against the cool clay wall and let the sounds of the courtyard lull you. A breeze rustles the vines. Somewhere, a jug tips water into the garden basin with a rhythmic gluk gluk. In the background, the soft clinking of bowls and quiet laughter fills the space between shadows. Ardashir lights a lantern but dims it quickly. "Too much light ruins the cool," he says. And as your bowl of frozen grape must melt slowly in your hand, you feel something extraordinary. Not just relief from the heat, but a kind of borrowed belonging. A softness. A piece carved by clay, water, and time. You sleep deeply that night in the cool silence of the courtyard, the stone beneath your bedding still radiating a slow, subterranean chill. When you wake, the world feels muted, just a touch of light on the horizon, the hum of wind beginning its slow crawl through alleyways. Ardashir is already up, sipping tea so black it could pass for midnight. "Today," he says with a raised brow, "we're leaving the city." You travel by camel now, its hooves soft against the sand, tail swaying with hypnotic rhythm. The city shrinks behind you, swallowed by the gold and gray of the open plain. Hours pass. The sun climbs. But you're headed toward a place few travelers ever really understood, a kind of religious coolness, not just physical but spiritual. The Zoroastrian fire temple you approach is humble but ancient, its ochre walls bleached by centuries of heat. There is no grand entry, no columns, just a silence so complete you can almost hear your own heartbeat bouncing off the clay. Inside, the sacred fire burns eternal, its flickering flames strangely defiant in the heat. But hidden beyond the fire chamber is something less known, a quiet cellar half dug into the mountain's edge. Here, the priests kept cool, not for comfort, but for ceremony. Zoroastrians, the dominant faith of ancient Persia, revered fire, but they also deeply respected balance. Heat, in excess, was not considered virtuous. Coolness was clarity. In some rituals, water and ice were offered alongside flame, not to oppose it, but to represent harmony. Cold wasn't the enemy of light. It was its necessary counterpart. Mainstream scholarship notes that some temples had ice stores built beneath them, not unlike yakchals but on a smaller scale. These were used to chill ritual drinks, preserve herbs, and, according to a few dusty manuscripts, cool the foreheads of priests before they entered high ceremony. Cold as purification. Fringe theory? One temple log from Yazd includes a drawing of a small dish holding what appears to be frozen milk and saffron labeled golden silence. Golden. Was it dessert? Medicine? A sacrament? Historians still argue. One insists it was a ceremonial offering to Mithra. Others believe it was simply a priest's reward for completing a 12-hour chant session without fainting. If you've ever tried fasting in 42 degrees C heat, you'd sympathize. Zoroastrianism is often remembered for fire and light, but its texts also speak of Spenta Armaiti, the divinity of earth, calmness, and serenity. Cold, in its most sacred form, was a kind of stillness. It stopped the world just long enough for reflection. You wander through the cool chamber beneath the temple, touching the smooth stone walls. It's quiet. Even your camel has stopped grunting outside. For a moment, the desert world above feels impossibly distant, like someone else's fever dream. Ardashir sits beside you and lights a tiny lamp, its flame barely flickering. He pours you a drink, chilled barley water with honey and a hint of mint. You sip in silence. Balance, he says. That's what they were after. Not luxury, not escape, just stillness. You look around at the cold, sacred shadows. This wasn't about indulgence. It was about clarity, ritual, and surviving a climate that never asked permission. In the heat of Persia, cold wasn't an indulgence. It was a kind of prayer. And now, that prayer is echoing off the walls, long after the priests and their sacred fires have gone quiet. You leave the temple as the light begins its descent again, softening the sharp edges of the mountains. The desert sprawls before you like a great parchment, creased and burned in places, but filled with stories inked by survival. Your camel lumbers forward, unbothered by metaphors, while Ardashir hums a tune older than cities. You're heading now toward a nomadic encampment, pitched on the dry steppe like a patch of woven shadow. Tents of felt and wool rise gently against the wind, their ropes creaking slightly in the evening breeze. Smoke curls lazily from cook fires. Children chase goats. And somewhere, ice is waiting. You're skeptical, and reasonably so. Nomads and ice don't seem like natural companions. But as Ardashir reminds you, the ancient Persian world wasn't a series of isolated technologies. It was a network. Trade, ideas, even seasonal cold, moved. In the heart of the largest tent, an elder sits beside a rough-hewn chest buried halfway in the ground. She opens it slowly, revealing a dark, felt-lined interior filled with sawdust and cloth. She peels it back like a ritual. And there it is, a fist-sized block of ice, still intact, cool mist rising from its surface like breath. They call it yak-e-safar, traveling ice. Harvested from communal yakchals in early spring, wrapped in layers of straw and felt, then transported by camel caravan into the plains. The ice was rationed carefully, mostly for medicine, but on rare nights, like this one, it became dessert. You're handed a wooden bowl, inside which rests a simple concoction: pounded dates, goat's milk, and slivers of crushed ice. It's both rustic and refreshing, like eating history with a spoon. Mainstream historians often overlook these nomadic communities in discussions of Persian cooling culture, focusing instead on urban infrastructure. But oral records passed down among tribes tell a different story: of traders who carried ice in hollow reeds, of springtime journeys mapped not by stars, but by snowfields, and of camps that used clay-lined pits to extend the life of their frozen treasure. Fringe detail? One tale, often dismissed as legend, claims that a caravan leader once bribed an entire city council with a chest of ice during a drought, gaining exclusive access to their northern pastures. The city, reportedly, agreed. A cold bribe in a hot war. You sit beside the fire, eating slowly, as the elder recounts stories of how her grandmother used to cool feverish children by wrapping their feet in ice-packed cloth. Another says they'd leave a sliver of snow in the center of the tent during prayer, letting it melt as an offering to the spirits of the mountains. Historians still argue whether these techniques were shared among all nomadic groups or remained specific to certain tribes. But the evidence is mounting, literally. Excavations of old encampment sites have turned up fragments of insulated jars, collapsed straw-lined pits, even the charred remains of clay bowls used for freezing water during unseasonal cold snaps. What's striking is not just the ingenuity, but the values embedded in it. Ice wasn't wasted. It was treasured, divided with care. No one took a second portion unless everyone had their first. You glance around at the circle of faces in the firelight, leathery, laughing, faintly dusted with frost from the open bowl passed between them. The children sip slowly. No one talks over the elder. No one gulps. Ardashir leans over and says quietly, "In the cities, they had engineers. Out here, they had memory." You smile, letting the last bite melt on your tongue, cool and date-sweet. And you realize that ice, whether served in a copper bowl or buried in a goat skin, wasn't just for cooling. It was for connection, a shared miracle, repeated one sliver at a time. Morning arrives dressed in silence. The nomad camp stirs slowly. Goats bleat, kettles clink. The first bits of sun creep over the steppe, like a cat that knows it's not welcome just yet. You rise with aching knees, but a clearer mind, already missing the curious comfort of crushed ice and goat's milk. Today, Ardashir says, you'll trace the pathways of cold, how ice and chill weren't just stored but moved across the empire. Because for the ancient Persians, ice was never just a product, it was part of a system, flowing through trade routes like silk, lapis, or grain. You mount your camel and follow one such forgotten trail. The road, if you can call it that, winds through dry gullies and beneath the ruins of stone arches. It's not empty. You pass travelers, herders, and small caravans loaded with sacks and jars. In one, you spot a bundle swaddled in felt, lashed tight to a donkey's back. Ardashir nods toward it. That one carries ice. How far? You ask. 3 days, he shrugs, as if 3 days in the sun with a melting burden is just another Tuesday. This is the secret of ancient cold logistics, the relay. Ice wasn't always brought directly from mountains to markets. It was passed like a sacred scroll, from station to station, family to family, via routes known only to those with sunburned maps and trustworthy hands. And it wasn't just ice that moved. Cold desserts, flavored syrups, even pre-chilled dishes wrapped in leaves and linen made their way across the empire. Mainstream historians acknowledge that the Persian postal system, the Chaparkhane, was among the most advanced of its time. Riders could cover 150 miles a day, changing horses at intervals. But lesser known is how parts of that system were adapted seasonally to move perishables, delicate herbs, medicines, and yes, ice. Special saddlebags with double-layered linings, earthenware containers buried in wet sand, traders who traveled at night, resting by day beneath rocky overhangs or hollowed wells. Fringe theory? One source claims that Persian engineers experimented with reflective shields, bronze or polished tin, used to direct sunlight away from cargo or reflect heat upward. Were they effective? No one's quite sure. But a clay tablet in the Persepolis archives lists mirror plates for snow convoy, so someone tried. The route you follow soon passes an ancient way station, crumbled walls, a half-intact windcatcher, and the broken skeleton of what was once a yakchal, now open to the sky. Ardashir crouches and presses his hand to the ground. "Still cool," he says, "even after all this time." He tells you about the ice brokers, middlemen who oversaw regional cold transport. Some were glorified merchants. Others worked directly for noble houses, ensuring their summer guests didn't arrive to find lukewarm wine or soupy dessert. They knew the routes, they knew the weather, and more importantly, they knew whom to bribe when a shipment arrived late. There's one delightful record of an ice broker who charged double to deliver snow during a solar eclipse, calling it holy frost. Another claimed to be the personal ice supplier to the king, though scholars now believe he just worked near a palace and had good handwriting. As you descend into a valley dotted with scrub trees, Ardashir gestures to a low sunken mound. It's another yakchal, but this one's collapsed. Partly buried, its dome cracked like an eggshell. Inside, you see fragments of ceramic jars and the remains of a broken ice sled, its wooden frame held together with leather straps. This was once a hub, he says, a cold depot in a hot web. You sit on the edge of the mound, feeling the breeze tunnel up through the ruins. It still smells faintly of wet clay, like the memory of coolness refuses to leave. Historians still argue about the scope of this network. Was it empire-wide? Were there contracts? Did local lords keep exclusive access to certain cold routes? The evidence is fragmentary, but what emerges is a pattern. An empire that didn't just endure the heat, it mastered it, and moved cold like currency. As the sun dips low again, your caravan stops beside a stream. Ardashir hands you a flat cake, its center hollowed and filled with a frozen paste of dates and herbs. "Caravan ice cream," he says. You bite in. It crunches, melts, soothes. And somewhere, 3 days behind you, a donkey is still walking, its pack sweating through felt, carrying what might be tomorrow's miracle. The next morning you follow a narrow trail lined with scrubby fig trees and wild thyme. The path feels ancient, like it remembers being walked by people who carried baskets instead of maps. You're heading toward one of Persia's greatest architectural marvels, though you wouldn't guess it from the modest curve of land ahead. Then Ardashir stops and points to the ground. At first it looks like nothing more than a dip in the terrain, a shallow furrow, maybe a dry creek bed. But as you walk closer, you hear it. Faint, but constant. A whispering sound, like someone pouring tea behind a wall. Qanat, Ardashir says. This is the secret river beneath Persia. A qanat is an underground water channel, miles long, sometimes more, dug on a gentle slope from mountain aquifers to dry plains. It moves meltwater across impossible distances, cooled by darkness and gravity. And for thousands of years, it turned deserts into places you could live, work, grow wheat, and yes, make ice cream. You follow the line of small ventilation shafts that dot the surface like a breadcrumb trail. These vertical holes, spaced every 20 to 30 meters, allowed workers to access the channel during its construction and maintenance. Looking down into one is like staring into a well that's trying to keep a secret. Mainstream historians credit the qanat system as one of the most sophisticated water management technologies in the ancient world. It required precise engineering, too steep, and water flowed too fast and eroded the tunnel. Too shallow, and the water stagnated or never arrived. But done right, it provided year-round access to cool, clean water, even in regions that hadn't seen rain in months. And guess what ran alongside these channels? Cold. Homes and markets near qanats often used the chilled water to keep food fresh, drinks cool, and bodies from overheating. Entire streets were designed around underground flows, walkways paved with stones that rested above the channels, transferring coolness like ancient floor heating in reverse. Quirky detail? In some cities, certain families were said to have colder qanat water, closer to the source, better shaded, less disturbed. Marriage proposals were sometimes influenced by this. A son with a house near first water was considered prime material. You think dating apps are picky? Try ice-based dowries. You crouch by a vent shaft, feeling a cool draft rise up, and wonder how long that water has been traveling. Days? Weeks? It probably started as snow, high in the mountains, now gliding through stone and shadow like a ghost. Some fringe theories even suggest that certain ice houses, like the Yakchals you visited, were connected directly to qanats, using flowing meltwater as a refrigeration boost. There's little physical evidence, but texts from the Sasanian period describe flowing snow channels used to refresh the chambers of the dome. Whether literal or poetic, it paints a picture of desert engineers who didn't just endure nature, they collaborated with it. Ardashir leads you to a shaded stone alcove where a small fountain bubbles gently. You dip your hands in. The water is cold, shockingly so. He pours you a cup, adds a pinch of dried mint, and a splash of rose syrup, and hands it over. You're drinking a 1,000-year-old idea, he says. You sip, and it tastes like a paradox. Sunlight and snow, history, and hydration. Above ground, the world bakes. Below, an invisible lifeline moves quietly through darkness, connecting mountain snow to city sorbet. Historians still argue how many qanats once existed. Estimates range from thousands to tens of thousands across the Persian Empire. Many have collapsed or dried out. But even today, a few still run, sustaining remote villages, watering pistachio groves, and whispering their way through forgotten soil. You sit quietly, cup in hand, as the sun starts to dip. A donkey brays in the distance. Somewhere beneath your feet, water glides on, cold and patient. And in that moment, you realize the true genius of Persian ice wasn't just that it existed, it's that it flowed. The sun dips low again, painting the landscape in slow golds and sleepy shadows. You ride in silence for a while, lulled by the gentle sway of your camel and the quiet hush that seems to settle into every crack of this ancient world. Ardashir, as always, walks a few paces ahead, but tonight he walks slower, thoughtfully, like he's leading you toward a memory. "You've seen the systems," he finally says. "Now let's talk about the tweaks." You tilt your head. "Tweaks?" "Microclimates," he says with a grin. "Before thermometers, before climate science, we had the real thing, manual weather." He's not joking. Tonight he takes you to a village that, on paper, should be roasting. Low elevation, flat desert, not a whisper of mountain air. But as you enter its borders, you immediately feel the difference. The air is cooler, softer. You catch the scent of damp earth, and even the breeze feels curated, like someone tuned it to evening lullaby setting. This village, it turns out, is famous not for its location, but for its design. Everything from its street grid to its house heights to the color of its walls was created to hack the heat. Persian cities and villages used architectural tricks to manipulate their environments, and they were good at it. Mainstream scholars call this climatic urbanism, though locals just call it smart living. Streets are laid out to channel wind. Homes are clustered for shade. Even plants, pomegranate trees, tall reeds, are placed not just for beauty, but for moisture retention and strategic cooling. Walls are painted in pale clay to reflect the sun. Alleys run narrow so that sunlight can only briefly reach the ground before slipping away. One standout trick? Roof heights are staggered to create temperature zones. Taller homes cast shade on shorter ones. Chimneys double as wind vents. And underground rooms, not quite cellars but close, become refuges during the midday burn. You're invited into one such home. The family is preparing dinner, but their refrigerator isn't humming. It's buried. A pit beneath the kitchen stores perishables, with cold air channeled down from a nearby bajir. There's no condensation, no buzzing, just quiet coolness. In the corner, a ceramic jar of dew, chilled yogurt drink, is resting against a bowl of iced melon balls, both frosted with desert chill. Fringe detail? Some homes even use double-layered clay jars. An inner pot for food, an outer pot filled with damp sand. As the sand evaporated, it cooled the inner container. It's called a zir, and you can still find them today in villages that don't trust modern fridges. Why? Because they work, and they never lose power. You sip some of the dug. It's salty, tangy, and cold enough to make your teeth hum. "We don't just make ice," your host tells you. "We keep it." And that's the beauty of this place. It's not reliant on monumental yakchals or giant windcatchers. It's a village scaled for cold. Every home, every surface, Every planter box works together to take the edge off the heat. Historians still debate how coordinated these villages were. Was there a master planner, a royal architect, or was it just collective wisdom, layered over generations, refined by trial, error, and community gossip? Some say it was both. Government investment in public cooling infrastructure and grassroots genius that made it truly livable. You step out again as the sky turns a velvety blue. Children are pouring water into ceramic channels that run along the courtyard walls. Not just for plants, these act as micro-evaporative coolers. Within minutes, the air feels lighter, the walls cooler to the touch. And you realize, this isn't a forgotten trick. It's a philosophy, a decision made, day after day, to live with the heat, not under it. No fans, no compressors, no button that says cool, just earth, water, wind, and willpower. Morning finds you standing on a dusty hill overlooking a diplomatic complex. Stone buildings arranged in elegant symmetry, with shaded courtyards and carefully tended trees swaying like diplomats in conversation. This isn't a palace. It's not a market. It's something in between, a place where alliances were formed, marriages arranged, wars averted, and, surprisingly, ice cream served. You're about to witness the most polite use of ice in human history, Ardashir announces, arms spread wide. Welcome to Persian ice diplomacy. It sounds ridiculous, but it's real. In the Achaemenid Empire, and even long after, cold desserts weren't just culinary art. They were political theater. In the scorching heat of negotiations, where tensions simmered hotter than the midday sun, offering an iced sherbet or a bowl of snow-laced rose water could do more than refresh. It could disarm. Mainstream sources mention royal banquets and diplomatic meetings where ice was deployed with strategic charm. One account tells of a satrap welcoming a foreign emissary not with fanfare, but with a bowl of chilled honey-lemon sorbet served in a silver shell. The emissary was so delighted he agreed to extend trade rights before the actual talks began. Now that's dessert diplomacy. The idea was simple. Comfort opens conversation. You're more likely to agree to grain tariffs if your mouth is busy celebrating an explosion of mint and crushed ice. You enter one of the restored halls, a stone-walled chamber with deep windowsills and a sloped ceiling. Ardashir points out a corner platform where servants once stood behind screens, bringing out one dish after another in timed procession. The grand finale? Always something cold. Quirky detail? One set of negotiation guidelines preserved on clay tablets in Elamite script mentions specific cooling intervals during long discussions. Apparently, if things got too heated, literally or metaphorically, a short break was called for iced refreshments. These pauses weren't seen as delays, but as courtesies. The ancient version of, let's all take a breath and revisit this calmly. And this wasn't exclusive to Persian diplomats. Once the tradition spread, neighboring courts began to adopt it too. In Babylon, guests were served snow wine flavored with figs. In early Bactria, emissaries exchanged chilled pomegranate bowls as tokens of friendship. The practice became contagious, because really, who doesn't want a frozen drink during a 3-hour treaty debate? Historians still argue how formalized this was. Was it ritual, habit, or improvisation? Did host cities compete for the best cold dessert offerings to impress visiting dignitaries? At least one record mentions a minor prince sulking for days after being served a syrup of inferior consistency. Whether true or not, the implication is clear. Icy hospitality mattered. Fringe theory? A few scholars even suggest that a particularly elaborate sherbet recipe, the seven-flower ice, originated from a treaty negotiation gone sideways. According to the story, both sides refused to agree on anything, so the hosts kept bringing increasingly lavish desserts to stall for time. By the time they reached 7 flowers and 6 syrups, everyone was too sugared and chilled to argue anymore. You step outside again into the soft heat of midday. A table is set beneath a fig tree. You're served a dish known as aksar, a delicate dome of crushed ice infused with green grape extract, crushed basil, and a hint of salt. It hits your palate like a soft breeze through a curtain. You could surrender after this, you admit, eyes half closed. Ardashir laughs. Exactly the point. This wasn't just sweetness, it was subtlety. An empire that could control ice in the desert could certainly control a conversation. And somewhere in the archives of some forgotten city, there's probably a treaty that reads, signed willingly, after the third bowl of saffron slush. The sun is dipping again, trailing long shadows across a village square as old as storytelling itself. You sit on a low wall, watching the last market vendors pack up. Ardashir sits beside you, unusually quiet. When he finally speaks, it's not with one of his usual facts or jokes, but a question. Ever heard of the Snow Queen of Yazd? You shake your head. He leans in, voice low. She may never have existed, or she might have invented Persian ice cream. You blink, unsure if this is another of his sly openings. But he's already telling the tale, as the sky shifts from peach to violet. According to legend, in the mountain city of Yazd lived a noblewoman, name long forgotten, but her title remained, the Snow Queen. She was said to be obsessed with cold, not in a mad, frostbitten way, but with reverence. She believed cold preserved the soul, that silence only came through snow, and that ice could hold emotions, if shaped just right. She was rumored to rise before dawn to gather frost from temple rooftops. She'd mix it with flower essences and fruit pulp, shaping it into tiny sculptures, swans, fig leaves, pomegranate halves, and serve them in chilled alabaster dishes to poets, priests, and peasants alike. Mainstream historians find no direct record of her, no inscriptions, no estate documents. But in Yazd, you'll find a lane still called Kuche-e-Yak Bibi, Ice Lady's Alley. And in the city's oldest yakchal, there's a carved lintel with a single word, Namakdan, salt bowl. Quirky detail? Some oral traditions claim she flavored her desserts with mineral salt, believing it locked in the cold. Others say she was the first to preserve wild rose petals in ice, a practice still done today during Nowruz. Fringe scholars, usually the romantic ones, suggest she wasn't a noble at all, but a kitchen steward who became a legend simply because she made the best falude in town. That she served it during a famous wedding where a last-minute snow delivery saved the event. That the groom wept. That the bride left with the dessert recipe and not the husband. Truth? Fiction? Some sleepy swirl of both? Ardashir shrugs. Historians still argue, but people remember her. And perhaps that's the point. In a desert empire where ice was treasure, the one who shaped it into joy became myth. Whether she was real or not, the Snow Queen of Yazd became a symbol, not just of desert, but of devotion to coolness, elegance, and kindness in a world constantly burning at the edges. You sit in silence, imagining her, barefoot on cold tiles, holding a bowl of saffron snow in trembling hands, offering it to someone with a smile that said, "You're safe from the sun, if only for a while." Around you, the air softens. A child giggles nearby, chasing a stray goat. Somewhere, someone is crushing mint with a mortar, and if you listen closely, the desert itself seems to sigh, content, for now, to remember. The road out of Yazd curls lazily through a valley ringed with ochre hills and small orchards clinging to the last scraps of winter moisture. You ride quietly, still haunted, in the gentlest way, by the Snow Queen's ghost. But Ardashir seems energized. Today's story, he says, is less about myth and more about mystery. "You've heard what they say," he begins. "But what do we know?" You're venturing into scholarly territory now, the cold battleground of academic debate. Specifically, was ancient Persian ice cream truly ice cream? It sounds like an odd question. You've seen the yakchals, tasted the falude, sipped the snow-cooled dew. Surely that counts. Not so fast. Mainstream historians tend to agree that ancient Persia created frozen desserts. The snow, the fruit pulp, the syrups, it's all documented. But ice cream, in the sense of dairy-based, churned, emulsified concoctions, that's where things get slippery. One camp argues that early Persian sherbet, those shaved ice and syrup delicacies, should be classified as proto-sorbets, not ice cream. After all, they lacked milk or cream. They weren't churned. They were served quickly and melted fast. Delicious? Absolutely. But ice cream? Then there's Team Dairy. This group believes that, while the earliest Persian confections were fruit-based, later dynasties, especially during the Sasanian and early Islamic periods, began to incorporate milk, rice, and even animal fats into frozen desserts. One 9th-century text describes a cold sweet of milk and pomegranate, beaten smooth and buried in the snow. Sounds suspiciously like a milkshake with stage fright. Fringe theory? Some scholars have proposed that Persian chefs may have discovered primitive emulsification techniques long before European inventors did. By using natural stabilizers like orchid flower, salep, or ground lotus seeds, they could have achieved a creamy texture without modern churning. One clay fragment from central Iran contains a recipe fragment that begins, "To thicken the snow with root powder." The rest is missing. Classic. You pause beneath a wind-warped tree, letting your camel drink from a qanat-fed trough. The air is dry, but not harsh. Ardashir scratches his beard. "You know what I think?" he says. "They didn't care about the definition. They cared about the moment." Maybe he's right. Maybe Persian ice cream wasn't a product. It was a performance, a ritual of cooling, a pause in the fire of life. Whether it was milk-based or not, churned or crushed, it brought smiles to sweat-drenched faces and turned negotiations, feasts, and family dinners into something transcendent. It wasn't about the label. It was about relief. Besides, even today, not all ice creams are created equal. Kulfi, gelato, sorbet, shaved snow, frozen yogurt, they all claim the title in their own ways. And if you handed the Snow Queen of Yazd a modern pistachio scoop, she'd probably just nod and say, "Ah yes, version 20. Historians still argue. Of course they do. That's their job. But while they debate definitions, the desert quietly remembers recipes, passed down in whispers, scribbled into cookbooks, or simply carried in muscle memory. You mount your camel again and continue down the path. The sun is higher now, but you barely feel it. Not with the taste of pomegranate milk lingering on your tongue, and the idea that maybe, just maybe, you've eaten a dessert that outlived its own debate. You're nearing the edges of the empire now. The land is harsher, redder, and somehow more silent. Villages are sparser, and every tree you pass feels like a miracle with roots deeper than memory. But even here, where the earth begins to forget its own name, the legacy of Persian coolness continues. Time for a field trip, Ardashir says, leading you off the road. Ever wonder where the chill went after Persia fell? He's talking about the journey of ice across time and territory, how Persian innovations didn't end with the empire, but migrated, adapted, and occasionally rebranded under new rulers and new languages. You arrive at a ruined outpost perched above a wide plain. Half its walls have collapsed, but one doorway still stands, bearing a faint carving, a symbol of crossed reeds and water lines. This, Ardashir explains, was once a Persian garrison. Later, Mughal. Now you're in the world of cultural hand-me-downs, where knowledge doesn't disappear, but travels. When Muslim dynasties expanded eastward into the Indian subcontinent, they didn't just bring trade and politics, they brought ice logic. Mainstream historians document that by the 16th century, Mughal courts in India were serving their own forms of frozen treats. One, kulfi, is still beloved today, a dense, creamy dessert made with slowly simmered milk, flavored with cardamom, saffron, pistachios, or mango, and frozen in metal molds buried in ice salt mixtures. Sound familiar? Though often considered an Indian creation, kulfi bears striking resemblance to Persian desserts, not just in ingredients, but in method. Persian engineers had long used salt to lower the freezing point of water, enabling faster ice formation. This same principle appears in Mughal kulfi preparation centuries later. One emperor, Jahangir, was so obsessed with chilled sweets that he ordered snow to be brought down from the Himalayas for his personal kitchens. Historians still argue whether this was a regular operation or just an extravagant flex. Either way, the appetite for cold had clearly gone global. Fringe tidbit. In some accounts, Mughal cooks are said to have used tightly packed clay pots insulated with sheep's wool and buried in underground chambers, virtually identical to the Persian zir systems. They even flavored their ice with rose water, just as the Snow Queen might have done. But what's most compelling isn't the recipe, it's the idea that coolness was a chain, not a one-off invention. Persia taught India, which influenced the Ottomans, who then delighted European traders with tales of chilled feasts and sherbets. One Italian visitor in the 17th century described a banquet wherein the drinks were of snow and the fruits cold as rain. He thought it witchcraft. It was just heritage. And somewhere in this web of frozen evolution, Persian innovation lies quietly at the center, like the stem of a great culinary snowflake. You sit beneath the outpost's lone surviving arch. The air here is dry but surprisingly crisp. Ardashir hands you a wrapped dessert. Kulfi, frozen solid, flecked with saffron threads and almond slices. You take a bite, and the flavors bloom slowly. Warm spices inside cold silk. Not Persian exactly, he says, but her grandchild, for sure. You nod. This isn't the end of the story. It's a branch. Because even in a changing world of collapsing empires, shifting borders, and new kings, the taste of relief endures. Cold finds a way. And ice, once packed in straw by Persian hands, now rests in freezers around the globe. It traveled far, that little miracle, but somehow it never melted. The road home begins gently. You're back on the high plains of central Persia, where the air hums with that familiar dry warmth, sharp enough to sting your lips, but no longer hostile. It's strange how, after all you've seen, the desert feels less like an enemy. You know now that coolness has always been possible here. It's just had to be earned. Ardashir smiles as you both crest a ridge. Want to see someone lose their mind over a yakchal? He asks. You follow him down a path toward a dusty excavation site, a trench dug into hard-packed earth, surrounded by scaffolding and curious onlookers. A group of Europeans in sun hats and linen shirts are clustered near the edge, one of them gesturing frantically toward what looks like a giant upside-down beehive. They thought it was a tomb, Ardashir says, amused. Took them a week to realize it was an ancient fridge. You've arrived at the moment modernity rediscovers history, where engineers with advanced degrees stand slack-jawed before structures built by mud and intuition. This particular yakchal was uncovered only recently, after centuries buried beneath layers of sand and time. It's surprisingly intact, its walls thick, its foundation still echoing with the chill of 1,000 forgotten winters. Mainstream records show that during the 19th century, European travelers in Persia often noted the uncanny coolness of desert buildings. But it wasn't until the late 20th century that serious studies began to connect the dots, realizing these weren't just quirky ruins, but early refrigeration systems that functioned without electricity or moving parts. Engineers marveled at the materials. A composite mud brick called saruj, waterproof and thermally insulating. The shape? A perfect paraboloid, minimizing surface area and directing heat away. The location? Always chosen for airflow, shade, and soil stability. These weren't flukes. They were intentional. Quirky discovery? In one yakchal, a team found a stone carving of a lion licking a bowl, an apparent nod to the local legend that even animals were offered ice on especially brutal days. Whether it's true or not, the imagery stuck. Kindness wrapped in architecture. Fringe detail? Some modern climate scientists are now studying yakchal principles for use in sustainable design. There's talk of zero-energy coolers for refugee camps, built with the same materials and logic that once cooled rosewater in Persepolis. If the sun is going to shine anyway, why not design for it? One professor, Ardashir says, was so overwhelmed by the interior temperature of a restored yakchal, more than 25 degrees cooler than outside, that he cried. Actual tears. He reportedly called it An insult to every air conditioner I've ever owned. Historians still argue how advanced these systems really were. Were they the best of their time, or part of a larger, forgotten cooling tradition spanning multiple empires? Did Persia invent the passive refrigeration dome, or simply perfect it? The debates continue in journals and panel discussions, usually over iced coffee. But you're standing here now, inside the Yakchal's curved silence, and the numbers don't matter. It's cold, it's ancient, and it works. You press your hand to the wall. It's cool and dry, and for a moment you feel connected, not just to the people who built this, but to everyone who's ever stood here, sweating, hoping, and marveling. You step outside and squint toward the horizon. The sun is lowering again, and across the plain, you see a line of domes, some restored, some ruined, dotting the land like memory cairns. They don't shout. They don't gleam. They simply endure. Dusk settles across the land like a soft blanket pulled over a sleeping child. The hills, once blistering in the light, now blush faintly with lavender and ochre. You walk slowly beside Ardashir along a narrow ridge trail. There's no rush now. The story is nearly told, but not quite. This last stop, he says, isn't ancient, but it echoes everything we've seen. Below you lies a small modern village, flat-roofed homes, a school, a mosque, and something unexpected. A gleaming, solar-paneled dome rising above the trees. You think it's a water tank, maybe? But Ardashir shakes his head. That's a new Yakchal. Yes, really. Here in the 21st century, a group of architects and engineers have revived the ancient design, adapting it to modern needs. No longer just a relic, the Yakchal has returned, this time to keep vegetables fresh, store vaccines without electricity, and offer cool air to classrooms in remote villages. You step inside, expecting the novelty of it to overpower the charm. But the feeling is eerily familiar. The hush, the breath of cool air rising from the floor, the sense that time slows just a little when you're wrapped in earthen silence. Mainstream articles have started calling these structures desert refrigerators, praising their energy-free operation and astonishing durability. Some are used for food sovereignty projects, helping farmers preserve harvests without relying on fragile power grids. Others store medicine in refugee camps or cool data servers in arid climates. Quirky fact? One team in Yazd is experimenting with flavored ice again. Part research, part nostalgia. Their saffron honey slush is rumored to be made using a reverse-engineered recipe from a 12th century cookbook. And here's the poetic fringe twist. The new Yakchals are community-built, just like their ancestors. Families mix the mud. Children shape bricks. Elders remember the airflow patterns. It's a modern solution with ancient roots, shaped not by profit, but by memory and need. Historians, engineers, and environmentalists still argue over scalability. Can these systems be mass-produced? Are they just symbolic gestures or real alternatives? But in the heat of an Iranian summer, when a boy reaches into a chamber and pulls out a tomato that's still firm and red, no one asks for peer review. Outside, a woman waves to you from her courtyard. She's hanging wet cloths near her windows, an evaporative technique older than ink. Across the way, kids play beside a reed-lined channel, and in the center of the village, The dome glows faintly under the last rays of sun. Not electric, not loud, just there. You stand with Ardashir at the edge of it all. They remembered, he says quietly. That's all it takes. And now you know what he means. This story didn't end with empire or innovation. It lives in the dirt, in the clay, in the breeze, slipping through a narrow vent and across your skin. The coolness was never lost. It was waiting. Night falls with ceremony, stars unfurling above you like a script only the desert can read. The air is still warm, but without edge. You sit on a worn rooftop in the village, a shallow clay bowl of something sweet and cold resting in your hands. A final gift from the hosts, a dish of sharbati sekanja bean, mint and vinegar syrup poured over snow, finished with crushed cucumber. It's strange. It's perfect. You look out across the land. Distant lights flicker. Lanterns in windows. A motorcycle headlamp cutting across a path. Somewhere, a goat bell jingles. And beneath it all, the earth exhales coolness through qanats, domes, windcatchers. Ancient systems still breathing. Every empire has its weapons, Ardashir says beside you. Ours was temperature. You laugh softly, but he doesn't. He's watching the sky, the patterns of constellations ancient Persians once named after stories, animals, gods. We didn't just fight the desert, he continues. We made it pause. And maybe that's the heart of it. Every frozen treat, every chilled room, every shared bowl of falude in July, they weren't just pleasures. They were victories. Over heat, over chaos, over the certainty that some things, like fire, are unchangeable. Cold was a kind of resistance. Mainstream historians often focus on wars, on dynasties, on the sharp things. But here, in the shadows of cooling domes and ice-fed canals, the legacy whispers differently. It says, we built comfort. We planned joy. We made space for breath, even when the air burned. Fringe theories will come and go. New articles will debate timelines, inventions, influence. But the truth isn't always buried in tablets or stone. Sometimes, it's in the taste of saffron on ice, or the hush of wind moving through a mud brick tunnel, or the silence of a child's first bite of snow. Ardashir rises. Time to rest, he says. You've seen enough to last 100 summers. You finish the last of your dessert and nod. The desert has grown quiet around you, not empty, but full of endings. And the cool in the air isn't just temperature. It's memory, settling softly like dust. And now, we slow everything down. The stars above blur gently, and your breathing matches the hush of the night. The words fade, their rhythm stretched long and low. The world shrinks to your quiet breath, the weight of a blanket, the memory of cool stone beneath bare feet. You imagine a breeze moving through an old courtyard. Somewhere, a fountain murmurs. In the distance, a yakchal watches the moon rise. You are safe. You are still. And everything that was too hot, too loud, too sharp, softens. Let the cool wrap around you. Let the story end without hurry. Let the hush remain.